Somewhere beneath the cold waters of the Baltic, swallowed by centuries of shifting sand and forgotten memory, lies the fortress that launched 1,000 nightmares. No archaeologist has ever found it. No spade has turned the soil that would prove its existence beyond doubt. And yet, for 3 centuries, the very name of this place made kings reach for their swords and mothers pull their children close in the darkness. Jomsborg. The name sounds like a stone dropped into still water. It carries weight, it carries menace, and it carries one of the most extraordinary mysteries in all of Viking history. The story of a brotherhood of warriors so fearsome, so disciplined, and so utterly unlike anything else in the medieval world that scholars still argue whether they were real at all. But here is what we know. We know that something existed in the southern Baltic during the 10th and 11th centuries, something that terrified the most battle-hardened peoples of northern Europe. We know that warriors claiming allegiance to this brotherhood fought in some of the bloodiest conflicts of the Viking Age. We know that they left a mark on history so deep that even when the fortress itself vanished from the earth, the legend of the men who dwelt there refused to die. And we know how they met their end. On a day when the sea ran red with blood and the screaming of gulls mixed with the screaming of the dying, 60-odd survivors of a shattered army knelt on a beach in Norway, hands bound behind their backs, awaiting execution. They had lost. Their fleet was burning. Their brothers were dead. And yet, according to every source that survives, they faced the axe not with terror, not with pleas for mercy, but with laughter. They laughed as the blade fell. This is the story of the Jomsvikings. To understand what made Jomsborg possible, you must first understand the world that created it, a world where the line between warrior and pirate blurred beyond recognition, where kings rose and fell with the seasons, and where the only law that truly mattered was written in iron and blood. The 10th century in Scandinavia was an age of transformation. The old ways were dying, slowly, painfully, one village at a time. Christianity was spreading from the south, carried by missionaries whose bravery or foolishness, depending on your perspective, led them into lands where Thor's hammer still hung from every warrior's neck. The great unified kingdoms we think of today, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, were still in the process of violent birth, their borders shifting with every battle, every alliance, every betrayal. And into this chaos stepped men who had discovered a profound truth. In a world where everyone was fighting, the man who fought best could name his own price. The mercenary tradition in Scandinavia was as old as the Viking Age itself. Warriors had always drifted from lord to lord, selling their spears to whoever offered the most silver or the best prospects for plunder. But these were individual arrangements, temporary loyalties that dissolved the moment a better offer appeared. What emerged in the southern Baltic was something different entirely, an institution, a permanent organization of professional killers bound together by oaths so severe that breaking them meant death. The sagas tell us that Jomsborg was founded sometime in the middle of the 10th century, though the exact date shifts depending on which source you trust. The most detailed account comes from the Jomsvikings saga, a text written down in Iceland around 1200, some 2 centuries after the events it describes. This presents an immediate problem for historians. 200 years is a long time for stories to travel from mouth to mouth, growing in the telling, shedding inconvenient details, acquiring supernatural embellishments. And yet, the Jomsvikings saga is not the only source. The Jomsvikings appear in the works of Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler writing in the 1070s, within living memory of the Brotherhood's active period. They surface in the Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson's great history of the Norwegian kings. They flicker through Danish chronicles and Icelandic genealogies. Too many sources from too many different places, all pointing toward the same fundamental truth. These men existed. The question is not whether they were real. The question is what they really were. The founding legend of Jomsborg reads like something from mythology rather than history, which is precisely why we must approach it with careful attention to what it reveals about how the Jomsvikings understood themselves. According to the saga, the fortress was established by a Danish prince named Palnatoki, a figure so skilled with the bow that later generations would credit him with a feat of marksmanship that should sound familiar to anyone who knows their Germanic folklore, shooting an apple from his own son's head. This tale would later be attached to William Tell, but Palnatoki had the story first, 1,000 years before the Swiss archer ever drew his bow. Palnatoki was, by all accounts, a difficult man. Proud, fierce, unwilling to bend his neck to anyone, including the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, whose conversion to Christianity was as much political calculation as genuine faith. The saga suggests that Palnatoki and Harald had a falling out of spectacular proportions, the kind that left bodies in its wake and forced the prince into exile. But exile for a man like Palnatoki was not the end of power. It was simply its relocation. The southern coast of the Baltic in the 10th century was a contested borderland, a place where Slavic tribes rubbed shoulders with Norse settlers, where old pagan traditions mingled with the first whispers of Christianity, where the authority of any king grew thin and eventually disappeared entirely. Here, at the mouth of a river that some scholars identify as the Oder, and others place further east, Palnatoki found his refuge. He called it Jomsborg, and what he built there was not simply a fortress, it was a new kind of warrior society. Picture, if you can, what this place might have looked like at its height. The Baltic coast here is low and marshy, cut through with rivers that meander toward the sea through reeds and mud flats. In the 10th century, before the great drainage projects of later eras, this landscape was even more amphibious. A world of islands and channels, of solid ground that dissolved into bog without warning, of sea fog that could hide an approaching fleet until it was almost upon you. Into this geography, the builders of Jomsborg drove their stakes and raised their walls. The fortress, if the sagas can be believed, was positioned to control the entrance to a great harbor, one capable of sheltering 300 longships at a time. The gates were iron-bound and massive, flanked by towers from which archers could rain death on anyone foolish enough to approach uninvited. A great chain could be raised across the harbor mouth, trapping ships inside or barring entry to enemies. Inside the walls, the buildings would have looked much like those in any substantial Norse settlement of the period. Long timber halls with pitched roofs thatched against the rain, their interiors dim and smoky from the fires that burned in central hearths. But these were not family homes. There were no cradles here, no looms, no children playing in the dust between the buildings. This was a military compound, and everything within it was organized around a single purpose: the making of war. The warriors who lived at Jomsborg slept in communal quarters, their weapons hung on the walls within easy reach. They ate together in the great hall, their meals served by thralls whose lives depended on quick service and silent tongues. They trained together in the courtyards, the clash of practice swords and the thud of bodies hitting the ground, forming a constant rhythm beneath the wheeling of the gulls. And they were bound together by the strictest set of laws that any warrior society in medieval Europe ever conceived. The Jomsvikings code was not simply a set of guidelines, it was an architecture of loyalty, a framework designed to transform individual warriors into an unstoppable collective force. Every man who passed through the gates of Jomsborg swore an oath to uphold these laws, and the penalty for breaking them was death, not the abstract death of divine judgment, but the very real death that came from the swords of one's brothers. No man could be accepted into the Brotherhood who was younger than 18 or older than 50. Strength alone was not enough. A warrior had to be in the prime of his fighting years, old enough to have acquired the skills of combat, and young enough to still possess the speed and endurance that warfare demanded. No man could speak ill of another Jomsviking, regardless of personal grievance. Disputes were to be settled by the chieftain, not by gossip or blood feud. The poison of internal conflict, which had destroyed so many other warrior bands, was to be excised before it could take root. No man could show fear in battle, regardless of the odds. To flee, to break ranks, to even give voice to doubt, these were capital offenses. A Jomsviking faced death as if it were simply another opponent, neither more nor less worthy of concern than any other. No man could take plunder for himself until it had been properly divided according to the laws of the Brotherhood. The treasure belonged to Jomsborg, and Jomsborg decided how it would be distributed. Individual greed was the enemy of collective purpose, and most remarkably of all, no women were permitted within the walls of the fortress. No wives, no concubines, no daughters. The Jomsvikings were, in effect, a celibate order, at least during their time of service. Their loyalty was to belong entirely to the Brotherhood. Family ties, those most powerful of bonds, were not merely discouraged but forbidden. This last provision stands out because it was so unusual in Norse society, where family connections formed the very fabric of social organization. A man without family was a man without protection, without inheritance, without place in the world. And yet the Jomsvikings deliberately severed themselves from these connections, creating a substitute kinship forged in oath rather than blood. The comparison to monastic orders is impossible to avoid. Like Christian monks, the Jomsvikings withdrew from ordinary society. Like monks, they took vows that bound them to a particular way of life. Like monks, they lived communally, in quarters designed for collective living rather than individual privacy. The great difference, of course, was that while monks copied manuscripts and prayed for souls, Jomsvikings perfected the art of killing. Some historians have suggested that the monastic comparison is not coincidental, that the Jomsvikings may have been influenced, at least indirectly, by Christian models of organized religious life filtering north through trade routes and missionary contact. Others argue that the similarities are superficial, that warrior brotherhoods arise naturally in certain social conditions, and that Jomsborg simply found its own solution to a universal problem: how to maintain discipline and cohesion among professional killers. Whatever the truth, the system worked. The Jomsvikings became the most feared fighting force in the north, their reputation for discipline and ferocity spreading far beyond the Baltic coast. But reputation alone does not fill a treasury, and the Brotherhood at Jomsborg was nothing if not practical about the economics of violence. They were not crusaders fighting for faith. They were not patriots fighting for nation. They were professionals, and professionals need to be paid. The Jomsviking business model was straightforward. Any king, earl, or chieftain who could meet their price could hire their services. The Brotherhood did not inquire too closely into the justice of a cause. Justice was for philosophers and priests. What mattered was whether the client could deliver the agreed-upon payment in silver, slaves, or land rights. This mercenary neutrality made the Jomsvikings valuable, precisely because it made them dangerous. If you were the king of Denmark, you could not assume that the fortress at Jomsborg would remain friendly simply because it was located within your sphere of influence. Next season, for the right price, those same warriors might be sailing up your rivers to burn your halls. The threat was constant, omnipresent, impossible to entirely eliminate through diplomacy or alliance. And so, the greatest powers of the region found it cheaper, in the long run, to keep the Jomsvikings on retainer than to face them in battle. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, the same king who had supposedly driven Palnatoke into exile, appears in the sources as a sometime patron of the Brotherhood. His son, Swine Forkbeard, the man who would eventually conquer England and place a Danish king on the English throne, was intimately connected with Jomsborg for much of his career. The relationship between the Danish crown and the Jomsviking Brotherhood was complex, evolving, and occasionally explosive. The kings needed the warriors needed the money. But kings are proud creatures, and mercenaries serve multiple masters. The potential for conflict was always present, simmering beneath the surface of apparent cooperation. Understanding who the Jomsvikings actually were requires us to look beyond the fortress walls at the broader context of professional violence in the Viking Age. The 10th century was the golden age of the Scandinavian mercenary. Across the known world, from the frigid waters of the North Atlantic to the sun-baked streets of Constantinople, Norse warriors were hiring themselves out to whoever would pay. The Varangian Guard, that famous unit of northern bodyguards serving the Byzantine emperors, was just taking shape during this same period, drawing its recruits from the same pool of landless, ambitious, combat-trained young men who might otherwise have sought their fortunes at Jomsborg. The comparison between the Varangians and the Jomsvikings is instructive. Both organizations drew from the warrior surplus of Scandinavian society. younger sons with no inheritance, ambitious men seeking glory, criminals and exiles looking for a second chance. Both offered a path to wealth and status that did not depend on the accident of birth. Both demanded absolute loyalty in exchange for membership in an elite fraternity. But the differences are equally telling. The Varangians served a single master, the Byzantine emperor, and their loyalty was ultimately personal. They fought for whoever sat on the throne in Constantinople. The Jomsvikings, by contrast, maintained their independence. They served their clients, not their rulers. When a contract was complete, they returned to Jomsborg, free to negotiate the next arrangement without reference to past allegiances. This independence was the Jomsvikings' greatest strength and ultimately their fatal weakness. It allowed them to remain above the petty quarrels of northern kingdoms, to play both sides of a conflict if the price was right, to maintain a flexibility that more conventional military forces could not match. But it also meant that they could never truly be trusted, that every alliance with Jomsborg came with an expiration date written in invisible ink. The warriors who filled the ranks of this brotherhood came from across the Scandinavian world, united not by birth but by skill and temperament. The sources give us glimpses of individual Jomsvikings, fragments of biography that hint at the variety of men who chose this life. There was Sigvaldi, who would become one of the most famous or infamous leaders of the Brotherhood, a man whose name appears in connection with some of the most dramatic events of the age. Sigvaldi was a jarl's son, well-born and well-connected, who could have lived comfortably on his family's estates. Instead, he chose Jomsborg, trading the certainties of inherited position for the risks and rewards of the mercenary life. There was Bui the Broad, a warrior of legendary strength whose nickname suggests a physical presence that must have been terrifying on the battlefield. The sagas describe him carrying 2 treasure chests into his final battle, determined that if he could not win, at least he would die rich. There was Vagn Akasan, the youngest of the great Jomsvikings, who at the age of 18, barely old enough to qualify for membership under the Brotherhood's own rules, would face death with a courage that became legendary. These were not anonymous soldiers, interchangeable parts in a military machine. They were vivid personalities, men of ambition and ego who had deliberately chosen a life outside the normal structures of society. They had given up family for brotherhood, home for fortress, the comfort of women for the company of warriors. They had made a bet that skill with weapons could earn them everything the world had to offer. For a while, that bet paid off spectacularly. The daily life of a Jomsviking, when he was not actually at war, would have followed a rhythm dictated by the needs of training and the realities of communal living. Wake at dawn, eat quickly, practice. Combat training in the Viking Age was not the formalized martial art that later medieval Europe would develop. There were no manuals describing the proper positions for sword and shield, no academies teaching a standardized curriculum of techniques. Training was practical, brutal, and constant. Men sparred with wooden weapons until they could fight with real ones. They wrestled until their bodies knew instinctively how to break a grip or escape a hold. They practiced ship handling until they could navigate by the stars and work together as a single organism, 60 men moving in perfect synchronization to the beat of the drum. The physical demands were tremendous. Norse warriors fought primarily with sword and shield, a combination that required both arms to be constantly engaged, constantly moving. A battle might last hours, a series of brutal close-quarters engagements that left even the victors exhausted and bleeding. Only men in peak physical condition could survive such ordeals, and the training at Jomsborg was designed to produce exactly that. Bodies hardened beyond normal limits, minds conditioned to continue fighting when every instinct screamed for retreat. But physical training was only part of the education. The Jomsvikings also had to learn the arts of naval warfare, which in the Viking Age meant learning to turn a ship into a weapon. The tactics that made Scandinavian raiders so terrifying involved sophisticated coordination between multiple vessels. Ships would be lashed together to create floating fighting platforms. Grappling hooks would bind enemy vessels close enough for boarding. Archers would sweep decks clear, while swordsmen waited for their moment to leap across the gap. All of this required practice, practice, and more practice, A Jomsviking who survived his first few battles did so because the movements had become automatic, ingrained so deeply that thought was unnecessary. The body knew what to do. The mind simply watched as the work got done. When not training, the warriors of Jomsborg would have spent their time in the endless small tasks of military preparation, maintaining weapons, repairing armor, tending to the ships that were their most valuable possessions. A longship was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a delicate thing, its clinker-built hull prone to damage from both combat and weather. The men who sailed these vessels understood that their lives depended on keeping them seaworthy. The smell of tar would have pervaded the harbor, that distinctive sweet sharp scent that clings to anything touched by the pine-pitch Scandinavians used to waterproof their ships. Mix in the salt of the sea, the smoke of cooking fires, the animal odor of men living in close quarters, and you have the characteristic atmosphere of any major Norse settlement. Jomsborg would have been no different in this regard, though perhaps more intense, more concentrated, given the exclusively military character of its population. The sound would have been equally distinctive. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal from the weapons practice grounds, the splash of oars as ships maneuvered in the harbor, the rough laughter of men who had faced death together and would face it again. The creak of timber as the great chain across the harbor mouth was raised or lowered, the cry of the gulls, ever present, ever hungry, drifting on winds that carried the smell of the sea. At night, the scene would have transformed, oil lamps and hearth fires casting dancing shadows on timber walls. Men gathered in the great hall, drinking the ale and mead that were the universal social lubricants of Norse culture. Stories being told, tales of battles won and enemies defeated, of gods and heroes, of the glorious deeds that awaited those brave enough to reach for them. The skalds, the poets who preserved and transmitted Norse culture, would have found eager audiences at Jomsborg. These were men who lived for glory, and glory in the Norse conception was meaningless unless it was remembered. A man's deeds died with him unless a poet turned them into verse that could be passed from generation to generation. The greatest reward a warrior could hope for was immortality in song, and the Jomsvikings surely commissioned their share of praise poems, boasting of victories and threatening future conquests. We can imagine the scene, firelight playing across weathered faces, the hush that falls when a poet begins to speak, the measured rhythm of alliterative verse filling the smoky air. Tales of Palnatoki's founding of the fortress, tales of battles fought and treasures won, tales that would eventually find their way into the sagas written down 2 centuries later, distorted by time and retelling, but carrying still some kernel of the truth about who these men were and what they believed. Yet even in the great hall, certain subjects would have been forbidden. The laws of the Brotherhood extended even to conversation, preventing the kinds of boasts and insults that could escalate into blood feuds. A Jomsviking could speak of his own deeds, but not at the expense of his brothers. Grievances were for the chieftain's ear, not public airing. This enforced harmony was essential to the Brotherhood's functioning. Mercenary companies throughout history have struggled with internal conflict. The competitive instincts that make men good at violence also make them prone to turning that violence on each other. The Jomsvikings solved this problem through absolute suppression of individual quarrels, forcing their warriors to channel all their aggression outward toward enemies rather than inward toward each other. The system created a distinctive psychology, a collective identity that subsumed individual ego into something larger. A Jomsviking was not simply a warrior who happened to live at Jomsborg. He was a Jomsviking, a member of a brotherhood, a holder of an identity that transcended his individual self. His glory was the brotherhood's glory. His shame was the brotherhood's shame. His death was simply the price of membership in something eternal. This was the true innovation of Jomsborg. Not the fortress itself, not the military tactics, but the creation of an identity so powerful that men would die for it without hesitation. The Roman legions had achieved something similar, forging individual soldiers into units that fought as one. The Spartans had their agoge, their brutal training system designed to subsume the individual into the collective. The Jomsvikings developed their own solution to the same ancient problem: how to make men fight beyond what self-interest would dictate. The oath was the key. When a man swore to uphold the laws of the Brotherhood, he was not making a promise he expected to break when circumstances changed. He was binding himself to a new reality, accepting a new identity that would govern his every action until death. The oath was not a contract, but a transformation. The clients who hired the Jomsvikings understood this quality and valued it accordingly. Other warriors might fight bravely when victory seemed likely, then melt away when the tide of battle turned. The Jomsvikings fought regardless of circumstances, not because they were immune to fear, but because their oath had redefined what fear could make them do. Flight was not merely shameful. It was impossible, a violation of identity so profound that death was preferable. This made them extraordinarily valuable to employers facing difficult military problems. If you needed a beach held against superior numbers until reinforcements arrived, the Jomsvikings would hold it or die trying. If you needed an enemy stronghold stormed regardless of losses, they would storm it. If you needed a rearguard action fought to the last man while your main force escaped, they were your men. The price for such services was correspondingly high. The sources do not give us precise figures, but the wealth that flowed through Jomsborg must have been substantial. Silver and gold from a dozen different kingdoms, slaves captured in raids across the Baltic, goods traded for the Brotherhood's guarantee of safe passage through waters they controlled. The economic footprint of Jomsborg extended far beyond its walls. And with wealth came power. Political power, the ability to influence who wore crowns and who lost them. The Brotherhood had no lands to defend, no subjects to govern, no temples to maintain. Their only capital was their reputation, and that reputation made them players in the great game of northern politics. It was this involvement in politics that would eventually destroy them. For the Jomsvikings, in their confidence and their hunger for glory, would make a choice that placed them on the wrong side of a conflict they could not win. They would sail north, toward Norway, toward a battle that would become the most famous defeat in Viking history, toward Hjörungavágr. But that story requires us to understand the political landscape of Scandinavia at the end of the 10th century, a landscape of competing kings, shifting alliances, and simmering religious conflict. The world that had created the Jomsvikings was changing, and change in this era was never peaceful. In the halls of power across the north, men were making plans that would determine the Brotherhood's fate. And at Jomsborg itself, the warriors were sharpening their swords, unaware that their greatest battle and their final hours lay waiting for them across the cold waters of the northern sea. The Scandinavia of the late 10th century was a world in violent transition, a landscape where the old ways and the new clashed with increasing ferocity. Christianity was advancing, not as a gentle wave of conversion, but as a political weapon wielded by ambitious kings who understood that the white Christ offered something the old gods could not: a divine mandate to centralize power, to break the independence of local chieftains, and to forge kingdoms from collections of warring territories. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth had embraced Christianity decades earlier, famously commemorating his achievements on the great runestone at Jelling, where he claimed to have made the Danes Christian. This was propaganda more than fact. The actual conversion of Denmark was a process spanning generations. But Harald understood the power of such claims. The Christian kings of the continent, particularly the Holy Roman emperors who pressed against Denmark's southern border, could hardly justify crusading against a fellow Christian monarch. And within Denmark itself, the new religion offered Harald tools of control that Odin and Thor had never provided. Bishops answered to him. Churches collected wealth in his name. The Christian concept of kingship, with its roots in the anointed monarchs of the Old Testament, elevated the ruler above the messy consensus building that had traditionally constrained Norse kings. But Harald's ambitions had grown too large for his aging grasp. His own son, Sweyn Forkbeard, had turned against him, and the old king had died fleeing his boy's rebellion, some said from wounds suffered in battle against Sweyn's forces, others from illness and heartbreak. The circumstances mattered less than the result. By the late 980s, Swine Forkbeard sat on the Danish throne, a man of tremendous ambition and ruthless calculation. Swine was a nominal Christian. Baptism was a political convenience he had accepted and would honor when it suited him. But his real religion was power. He looked west toward England, where the descendants of Alfred the Great ruled a wealthy kingdom that had been paying off Viking raiders for generations. He looked east toward the lands of the Wends and the opportunities for expansion there. And he looked north toward Norway, where a complicated tangle of alliances and enmities awaited anyone bold enough to intervene. Norway in this period was not a unified kingdom in any modern sense. The mountainous terrain and the long coastline had always encouraged local independence. Chieftains in the fjord country paid nominal tribute to whoever called himself king, but largely governed their own affairs. The real power lay not in any single crown, but in the complex web of relationships between powerful families, each jealously guarding its traditional rights and privileges. Into this fractured landscape had come Håkon Sigurdsson, known to history as Håkon Jarl, Håkon the Earl. He was not a king, though he ruled with a king's authority. His position was unique, a product of the era's confused politics. Technically, he governed Norway as a vassal of the Danish crown, a relationship established when Harald Bluetooth had extended his influence northward. But Håkon had transformed this subordinate position into something approaching independence. He had defeated Danish attempts to impose Christianity on Norway, most notably at the Battle of Hjörungavágr's predecessor conflicts. He had rolled back the missionary efforts and restored the worship of the old gods with a zealot's enthusiasm. And he had built a network of alliances among the Norwegian chieftains that gave him effective control over the richest and most powerful regions of the country. Håkon Jarl was, by all accounts, a formidable figure. The sagas describe him as a devoted servant of the old religion, a man who made bloody sacrifices to Odin and Thor, and who reportedly offered even human victims to ensure victory in battle. Some sources claim he sacrificed his own son before a crucial engagement, though this may be later Christian authors blackening his memory. What is beyond dispute is that Håkon represented the last great champion of paganism in Norway, a living symbol of resistance to the changes sweeping across Scandinavia. He was also aging. By the 980s, Håkon had ruled for decades, and his grip on power was beginning to weaken. His sons were grown men with ambitions of their own. The chieftains who had once eagerly followed him were calculating their positions for the succession that must inevitably come. And across the narrow seas in Denmark, Swine Forkbeard was watching, waiting for the moment when Norway might be ripe for plucking. It was into this volatile situation that the Jomsvikings would insert themselves, drawn by a combination of political manipulation and their own insatiable hunger for glory. The story of how this came about is one of the most celebrated sequences in all the sagas, a tale of feasting, boasting, oaths sworn in drunken bravado, and promises that could not be broken. The Jomsvikings saga tells us that the catalyst was a funeral feast. When Strud Harald, the father of the Jomsviking leader Sigvaldi, died, the Brotherhood gathered to honor him according to the ancient customs. Such feasts were not merely social occasions, but religious rituals of the highest importance. The dead man's spirit would be watching, judging whether his descendants honored him properly. The ale would flow freely, not just for pleasure, but as part of the sacred ceremonies that eased the deceased's passage to the next world. At this feast, Swine Forkbeard appeared, either by invitation or by calculated intrusion. The sources are unclear. What is clear is that the Danish king saw an opportunity. Here was the most formidable military force in the Baltic, gathered in one place, their judgment impaired by drink and their emotions heightened by the rituals of mourning. If he could bind them to his service, he could unleash them against his enemies. The mechanism he chose was the bragerfull, the ceremonial toast of boasting. This was an ancient tradition at such gatherings. Men would stand and make vows over their drinking horns, promising great deeds that they would accomplish in the coming year. These were not idle boasts, but sacred oaths sworn before the gods and the assembled company. A man who failed to fulfill his bragerfull faced not just mockery but spiritual disgrace. Sweyn rose first as a king might, and made his vow. He would conquer England within 3 years, driving out King Ethelred and claiming the throne for himself. It was an audacious promise, but Sweyn was young and ambitious, and perhaps genuinely believed he could accomplish it. In fact, he eventually would, though it would take longer than 3 years, and his success would be his son, Knut's, to enjoy. Sweyn himself dying just weeks after finally claiming the English throne in 1014. Then came the turn of the Jomsvikings. Sigvaldi, their leader, stood and gripped the great horn. The saga tells us he was a clever man, perhaps too clever, always calculating angles and advantages. But even clever men make mistakes when the ale is flowing and the company is watching, and the spirits of the dead seem to hover at the edges of the firelight. Sigvaldi vowed that he would sail to Norway and either drive out Håkon Jarl or die in the attempt. The hall erupted. Here was a vow worthy of the greatest heroes of old. Here was a promise that would shake the northern world. One by one, the other Jomsviking chieftains rose to add their own oaths, each trying to outdo the last. Thorkel the Tall, Sigvaldi's brother and one of the most formidable warriors of the age, vowed he would not flee from battle as long as Sigvaldi stood fighting. Bui the Stout, a legendary fighter known for his strength and ferocity, swore he would not retreat from any man his own age. Vagn Akeson, the youngest of the leaders at perhaps 18 years old, vowed he would not return to Denmark until he had killed Thorkel Lera, one of Håkon's most loyal supporters, and climbed into the bed of Thorkel's daughter. These were not metaphors. These were binding commitments, sealed by sacred ritual and witnessed by hundreds. When dawn came and the ale fog lifted, the Jomsvikings would find themselves committed to an invasion of Norway, an invasion that Sweyn had neatly manipulated them into undertaking, an invasion that would serve Danish interests regardless of whether it succeeded or failed. If the Jomsvikings won, Sweyn would have a weakened Norway on his northern border, perhaps even a client state he could dominate. If they lost, he would be rid of a dangerous military force that might someday threaten him. It was, from the Danish king's perspective, a perfect gambit. The Jomsvikings, for their part, seemed to have recognized the trap only after it had already closed. The saga hints at disagreements in the days following the feast, as cooler heads questioned the wisdom of attacking Håkon in his own territory, where he could call upon the full strength of Norwegian arms. But the oaths had been sworn. The only way forward was through. In the spring of the year traditionally dated to 986, though the exact chronology remains debated, the Jomsviking fleet assembled. The sources differ on its size, as they always do for medieval military forces. The most conservative estimates give Sigvaldi about 60 ships, the most extravagant speak of several hundred. The truth probably lies somewhere between, but even the lower figure represents a formidable armada. At perhaps 30 warriors per ship, 60 vessels would carry 1,800 fighting men, and these were not ordinary warriors, but the elite of the Baltic, each one sworn to the Jomsviking code, each one bound by oaths that made retreat impossible. They sailed north through waters the Jomsvikings knew well, past the islands where their ships had so often hunted merchant vessels, past the coastlines they had raided a dozen times. Spring in these northern waters is a treacherous season, with storms sweeping in from the Atlantic and fog banks rolling across the sea without warning. But the Jomsvikings were master sailors as well as master fighters, and they drove their dragons northward with practiced skill. The voyage itself was not without incident. Raiding parties went ashore to gather provisions and gather intelligence about conditions in Norway. Fishing boats fled at the sight of the dragon-headed prows, their crews racing to spread word of the approaching fleet. By the time the Jomsvikings reached Norwegian waters, Håkon Jarl would know they were coming. There would be no surprise. Some modern analysts have criticized Sigvaldi for this lack of secrecy, suggesting that a wiser commander would have moved faster and struck before the enemy could prepare. But this criticism misunderstands both the nature of Viking warfare and the Jomsviking ethos. These were not assassins creeping through the shadows. They were warriors seeking glory, and glory required witnesses. The whole point of this expedition was to demonstrate prowess, to add another legendary victory to the Brotherhood's already fearsome reputation. A surprise attack that caught Håkon unprepared would have been a lesser achievement than defeating him in open battle after he had mustered his full strength. There was also a practical consideration. The Jomsvikings were operating far from their base in unfamiliar waters against an enemy who knew every fjord and channel of his home territory. Speed might have been impossible even if they had desired it. Better to move methodically, to secure their supply lines, to probe for weaknesses in the enemy's defenses. Håkon Jarl, meanwhile, was not idle. The old earl had survived decades of northern politics by being both brave and cunning, and he applied both qualities now. His scouts brought word of the Jomsviking approach while the fleet was still days away. The numbers they reported were terrifying. Even discounting for the usual exaggeration of frightened messengers, the approaching force was clearly massive. Håkon immediately sent riders throughout his territory, summoning his vassals and allies, calling in every debt and favor accumulated over his long career. The response was impressive. Whatever the Norwegian chieftains thought of their aging lord, they understood what a Jomsviking victory would mean. Sigvaldi would not be content with defeating Håkon. He would impose Danish overlordship on Norway, backed by the Brotherhood's terrible swords. The choice was not between Håkon and some more attractive alternative, but between Håkon and subjugation to foreign masters. Even chieftains who had been quietly plotting against the old man rallied to his banner now. Håkon also called upon his sons, grown men with their own retainers and reputations. Eirik and Svein, the latter not to be confused with the Danish king, brought their household warriors to join their father's host. Eirik in particular was a formidable commander in his own right, destined to play a major role in Scandinavian politics for decades to come. He would eventually rule Norway as a vassal of the Danish crown, the very outcome his father had spent a lifetime fighting to prevent. But that was in the future. Now, father and sons stood together against the common enemy. The Norwegian fleet that assembled to meet the Jomsvikings was, by all accounts, substantially larger than the attacking force. The saga speaks of 300 ships, which would give Håkon a numerical advantage of perhaps 5-1. Modern historians tend to reduce these figures, but even the most conservative estimates suggest the Norwegians significantly outnumbered their enemies. For many commanders, such odds would have suggested caution, perhaps harassment tactics, perhaps strategic withdrawal to stretch the enemy's supply lines, perhaps an offer of negotiation to buy time. Håkon Jarl chose differently. He knew the Jomsviking reputation as well as anyone, knew that half measures and delaying tactics would only enhance their legend. If he could crush them utterly, in a single decisive engagement, he would send a message that would echo across the Baltic. Norway was not weak. Norway was not to be trifled with, and the Jomsvikings, for all their terrible reputation, could bleed and die like any other men. The two fleets met in a body of water the sagas call Hjörungavágr. The exact location has been debated for centuries, with various Norwegian fjords and bays put forward as candidates. The most commonly accepted identification places it somewhere along the western Norwegian coast in the region of Sunnmøre. But the precise geography matters less than what happened there. A naval battle of extraordinary ferocity that would become one of the most celebrated combats in all of medieval Scandinavian literature. The Jomsvikings arrayed their ships in a defensive formation, binding them together with ropes and chains to form a floating fortress. This was standard practice in Viking naval warfare, transforming the battle from a contest of seamanship into something closer to a land engagement fought on wooden decks. Men could move from ship to ship along the linked hulls, reinforcing threatened points and concentrating their strength where it was needed most. The formation also prevented individual ships from fleeing. Once you were tied into the line, your fate was bound to your brother's fate. Sigvaldi commanded the center of the Jomsviking line, the position of greatest honor and greatest danger. His brother Thorkel the Tall held one wing, while Bui the Stout anchored the other. Young von Oxen was positioned where he could bring his fierce energy to bear without getting the entire force killed by some rash impulse. It was a sound deployment for the circumstances, experienced leaders in the crucial positions, with the formation designed to maximize the Jomsvikings' advantages in individual combat skill. The Norwegians approached from the north, their superior numbers allowing them to extend their line far beyond the Jomsviking flanks. Håkon's plan was straightforward: fixed the enemy center with frontal pressure while his wings swept around to attack from both sides simultaneously. It was a classic envelopment strategy, the kind of maneuver that had destroyed armies since warfare began. Against most opponents, it would have worked beautifully. The Jomsvikings were not most opponents. The battle began in the gray light of a northern morning, with war horns echoing across the water and arrows darkening the sky. The Norwegians came on in waves, throwing themselves against the Jomsviking line with desperate courage. They knew they faced the most dangerous warriors in the world, but they also knew they were fighting for their homes, their families, their very way of life. A man fights differently when his children might be enslaved if he fails. The initial clashes were staggeringly brutal. Norwegian ships would ram into the Jomsviking formation, their crews leaping across with axes swinging, only to be cut down by defenders who seemed to feel no fear. The sagas describe individual combats of almost superhuman intensity, men fighting with arms half severed, continuing to thrust and cut until blood loss finally dropped them. The water around the ships turned red. Bodies fell between the hulls and were crushed as the vessels ground together. The screaming of the wounded and the dying mingled with the clash of iron and the splintering of wood. For hours, the outcome hung in balance. The Norwegians had numbers, but the Jomsvikings had their oath and their terrible skill. Every attack was repulsed with fearful losses. Norwegian chieftains who had led men to war for decades died on Jomsviking blades, their retainers dying beside them. The channels between the ships became choked with corpses, men slipped on decks awash with blood, and still the Jomsvikings held. But no formation, however brave its defenders, can hold forever against overwhelming odds. And those odds were beginning to tell. The Norwegian wings had completed their envelopment. Ships pressed in from both sides now, and the Jomsvikings found themselves attacked from 3 directions at once. Men who had fought magnificently for hours began to tire. Even the strongest arm eventually weakens. Even the most disciplined mind eventually clouds with exhaustion. The Jomsvikings had been fighting without pause since dawn, and now the sun was climbing toward midday. And still the Norwegians came on, fresh warriors replacing their fallen comrades in an endless rotation that the defenders could not match. It was then, according to the sagas, that something unexpected happened on the Jomsviking left. Jarl Sigvaldi, the man who had conceived this entire expedition, the leader who had sworn vengeance against Håkon Sigurdsson, suddenly cut the ropes, binding his ships to the main formation. Without warning, without explanation, without even a shout to his brothers, Sigvaldi ordered his fleet to raise sail. His ships pulled free from the battle line and began moving south, away from the carnage, away from the men who were dying in the formation he had designed. The sight must have been incomprehensible to those still fighting. Here was their commander, their Jarl, the man who had led them into this trap, fleeing while his warriors bled and died. 35 ships followed Sigvaldi's lead, their crews apparently unwilling to question their lord's decision in the chaos of combat. In a single stroke, the Jomsviking force was reduced by more than half. The men who remained found themselves suddenly catastrophically outnumbered. Why Sigvaldi fled has been debated for 1,000 years. The sagas offer various explanations, most of them unsatisfying. Some suggest he recognized that the battle was lost and chose survival over honor, but this seems impossible to credit for a man who had built his reputation on the Jomsviking code. Others claim he had made some secret arrangement with Håkon, that his entire expedition was an elaborate trap designed to destroy the Jomsviking Brotherhood from within. This explanation satisfies a certain narrative logic, but there is no evidence to support it beyond the suspicious coincidence of events. Perhaps the simplest explanation is the truest. Sigvaldi was afraid. For all his oaths, for all his position, for all his carefully cultivated reputation, when he looked across those blood-slicked decks and saw death approaching with Norwegian axes, his courage broke. He would not be the first leader in history to discover that his bravery had limits, nor the last. The moment of truth reveals what a man truly is, and Sigvaldi was revealed as something less than his brothers believed. But here is where the story of Hjörungavágr transforms from a battle into a legend. Because the Jomsvikings who remained did not flee. They did not surrender. They did not even waver. With their numbers halved and their formation compromised, with Norwegians pressing in from every side and their own commander's sails disappearing over the southern horizon, they fought on with a fury that seemed to increase rather than diminish. Bui the Stout, commanding the remaining wing, became a demon of destruction. The sagas describe him wading through blood up to his ankles, his twin swords, named Fotbiter, and another whose name has been lost, rising and falling with mechanical precision. He killed and killed and killed, his massive frame absorbing blows that would have felled lesser men. When a Norwegian axe finally sheared away part of his face, carving off his nose and leaving his skull gleaming white through the ruin of his features, Bui laughed. He actually laughed, blood streaming down over his teeth, and kept fighting. "That'll make the Danish women less eager to kiss me," he reportedly shouted across the carnage. "But the Norwegian widows won't care how I look when I'm killing their husbands." Eventually, even Bui reached his limit. Wounded in a dozen places, his strength finally failing, he made a choice that would cement his legend forever. On his ship were 2 chests filled with gold, the war treasury of his contingent, the wealth that represented a lifetime of raiding and mercenary service. Rather than let it fall into Norwegian hands, Bui lifted both chests and threw himself overboard, taking his fortune into the dark waters of the fjord, gold and blood and a Jomsviking's final breath mingling in the cold Norwegian sea. Some later stories claimed that Bui transformed in that moment, that he became something not quite human, a draugr or a sea spirit that would haunt those waters forever. Fishermen in later centuries would speak of glimpsing a massive figure walking along the sea floor, 2 chests under his arms, his ruined face grinning up through the green darkness. Such tales belong to folklore rather than history, but they speak to the impact Bui's death had on the Scandinavian imagination. This was how a true warrior died, not surrendering, not fleeing, but choosing his own end on his own terms, laughing at death with his last breath. Thorkel the Tall, Sigvaldi's brother, fought with similar ferocity despite his siblings' betrayal. Unlike Sigvaldi, Thorkel was everything a Jomsviking was supposed to be: brave to the point of madness, skilled beyond measure, and absolutely committed to his brothers in arms. He had spent years building a reputation as one of the finest warriors in the north, and at Hjörungavágr, he proved that reputation was no exaggeration. The sagas credit him with personally killing more than a dozen Norwegian champions before he was finally overwhelmed. Yet even Thorkel was eventually subdued. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the Jomsviking formation finally began to collapse, Thorkel found himself surrounded by enemies too numerous to defeat. He did not die at Hjörungavágr. Instead, he was captured alive, though the manner of his capture speaks to the chaos of the battle's final hours. Some accounts suggest he was knocked unconscious by a blow to the head, others that he was simply dragged down by the weight of men who piled upon him until even his tremendous strength could not prevail. Young Vagn Oxen fought like a man possessed. Everything he had learned at Jomsborg, every technique drilled into him during years of training, every ounce of strength and speed his 18-year-old body possessed, he threw it all into the desperate defense. The sagas describe him killing more than his own weight in enemies, his sword never still, his battle cry ringing out over the dying screams of Norwegians and Jomsvikings alike. When his ship was finally boarded beyond all hope of defense, when the last of his crew lay dead or dying around him, Vagn was still fighting. It took 6 men to finally drag him down, and even then, he continued to struggle, biting and kicking and thrashing like a wounded wolf. The Norwegians who captured him bore the marks of his resistance for years afterward. By late afternoon, it was over. The Jomsviking formation had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Those few ships that remained afloat were captured hulks, their decks piled high with bodies, their timbers so soaked with blood that they would never come clean. The water of the fjord had turned dark with gore, and Norwegian sailors later reported that fish avoided that stretch of coast for years afterward, as if even the creatures of the sea were repelled by so much death. The Norwegian casualties had been staggering. Håkon Sigurdsson had won his victory, but the price made him weep when his commanders reported the final toll: Thousands of his men lay dead, loyal warriors, experienced fighters, men whose service could never be replaced. Several powerful chieftains had fallen, their deaths creating political complications that would take years to resolve. Entire families had been effectively destroyed, their fighting men wiped out in the space of a single afternoon. But Håkon had achieved his objective. The Jomsvikings were broken. The threat that had loomed over his realm for years had been crushed in a single day of terrible slaughter. And now came the question of what to do with the survivors. Perhaps 70 or 80 Jomsvikings had been taken alive, a remarkable number given the ferocity of the fighting, but explained by the exhaustion that had eventually overtaken even these legendary warriors. They were gathered together on the blood-soaked deck of a captured ship, their hands bound behind them, their weapons taken, their future now in the hands of the man they had come to destroy. Håkon Sigurdsson faced a choice that would define his legacy. He could ransom the captives, extracting wealth from Denmark while demonstrating his magnanimity. He could imprison them, keeping valuable hostages for future political leverage. He could even recruit them, offering them service in his own forces. Surely warriors of such quality would be worth the risk of disloyalty. He chose none of these options. The Jomsvikings had come to kill him, to overthrow his rule, to shatter everything he had built. They had killed thousands of his people. They had nearly succeeded in their mission. Håkon decided they would die for their presumption. All of them. Every last warrior who had survived the battle would be executed publicly, their deaths serving as a warning to anyone else who might contemplate challenging Norwegian independence. The executions were scheduled for the following morning. The survivors were kept bound throughout the night, denied food and water, left to contemplate their approaching deaths in the cold darkness. Norwegian guards watched them constantly, expecting perhaps to see fear, to hear pleas for mercy, to witness the legendary Jomsvikings revealed as ordinary men when death approached. What they witnessed instead was something else entirely. As darkness fell over the fjord and the captives awaited their execution, they began to talk. Not about escape, that was clearly impossible. Not about mercy, that would violate everything they had sworn. Instead, they talked about their lives, their battles, the deeds they had accomplished, and the comrades they had lost. They told jokes. They composed verses. They criticized each other's poetry with the casual cruelty that passed for affection among warriors. One man sang an obscene song about Håkon Sigurdsson's mother that had the Norwegian guards struggling not to laugh despite themselves. When dawn finally came, the Jomsvikings were led to the execution site, a rocky stretch of beach where the morning tide would wash away the blood. They were forced to kneel in a line, their hands still bound, a Norwegian executioner walking behind them with a heavy axe. Håkon Sigurdsson himself came to watch, along with his son Eric and many of the chieftains who had survived the battle. This would be a moment to savor, the final humiliation of the Brotherhood that had terrorized the North. What happened next has been told and retold for 1,000 years, each telling adding new details, new dialogue, new demonstrations of Jomsviking courage. The core of the story, however, remains consistent across all versions. The condemned men faced their deaths with a contempt for mortality that shocked and unsettled their captors. The first man to be executed was asked if he feared death. He reportedly replied that he would die as well as his brothers had died in battle. It was only fitting that they should share the same fate. The second man joked about his position, noting that at least he wouldn't have to endure the Norwegian winter. The third man asked only that the executioner strike cleanly, as he had a wager with one of his brothers about whether a man's eyes continued to see after his head was severed from his body. He planned to blink 3 times if they did. And so it went down the line. Man after man, facing the axe with jokes and jests and quiet dignity. No pleas for mercy, no tears, no attempts to bargain for their lives. These were Jomsvikings, and they would die as Jomsvikings had lived, bound by oaths that transcended the mere ending of breath. The executioner was a man named Thorkel Lera, chosen for his skill with the axe and his willingness to spend a morning in blood work. He was not a cruel man by the standards of his time, merely practical, Someone had to do this job, and he did it well. But as the executions proceeded, as head after head rolled across the bloody sand, something began to shift in Thorkel's manner. The jokes were getting to him. The absolute fearlessness was unnerving. These men were dying better than most men lived. When it came time to execute the young warrior Vagn Axen, something happened that would transform the entire proceeding. Vagn, still barely out of his teens, looked up at Thorkel with an expression of mild curiosity. "I'd like to make a request," he said calmly. "When you swing, I want to see if I can dodge the blow. If I manage to avoid the axe, I think it only fair that you spare my life." Thorkel looked at Håkon, who shrugged. What did it matter? The boy's hands were bound. There was no way he could avoid a proper axe stroke. Let him try, let him fail, let him die like all the others. What happened next has been debated by scholars for centuries. Some versions of the saga claim that Vagn truly did dodge the axe, that he threw himself forward at the exact moment Thorkel swung, and the blade passed harmlessly through the air where his neck had been an instant before. Other versions describe a different miracle, that at the moment of the stroke, another Jomsviking threw himself in front of Vagn, sacrificing his own life to save the young warrior. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Vagn Axen survived the executioner's stroke, and in that survival, something changed in the atmosphere of that bloody beach. The watching Norwegians, who had come expecting to witness the final humiliation of their enemies, found themselves instead witnessing something that felt almost supernatural. Here were men who truly did not fear death. Here were men whose courage exceeded anything ordinary warriors could understand. Håkon Sigurdsson's son, Eric, stepped forward. He had watched the executions with growing unease, and now he made a decision that would save Vagn Axen's life, and ultimately his own soul. "These are warriors of extraordinary quality," Eric said to his father. "Killing them gains us nothing but the brief satisfaction of revenge, but sparing them, bringing them into our service, that would demonstrate both mercy and wisdom. The world would know that we are not merely strong enough to defeat the Jomsvikings, but great enough to make them our allies." Håkon considered his son's words. The political logic was sound. These men, properly recruited, could be immensely valuable. Their reputation alone would add to Norway's prestige. And there was something else, something harder to articulate. Watching these men die without fear had unsettled the Jarl in ways he did not fully understand. Perhaps it would be better to stop the killing here, before the world began to wonder whether the Jomsvikings had actually won some kind of spiritual victory even in their defeat. The executions were halted. Vagn Axen and the remaining survivors were offered a choice, death or service to Norway. Most chose service. The Jomsviking Brotherhood had been effectively destroyed, but a remnant would live on, scattered, diminished, absorbed into the very kingdom they had come to conquer. Vagn Axen went on to have a long and eventful life. He married into a powerful Norwegian family, had children who became prominent in their own right, and died at an advanced age, surrounded by grandchildren who would carry his blood into future generations. But he never forgot Jomsborg. He never forgot the oaths he had sworn. As a young man standing in that mysterious fortress at the edge of the world, the Battle of Hjörungavágr was over. The greatest Jomsviking expedition in history had ended in catastrophic defeat. Sigvaldi's treachery, Bui's golden death, Vagn's impossible survival, all of it would pass into legend, told and retold, until the boundary between history and myth became impossible to discern. But the Jomsvikings themselves did not disappear with that defeat. The Brotherhood had been shattered, yes, but fragments remained. Thorkel the Tall, who had been captured rather than killed, would eventually ransom his freedom and return to the Jomsviking way of life. His subsequent career would take him to England, where he would play a crucial role in events that would reshape the entire island's history. Other survivors scattered across the Scandinavian world, carrying with them the skills and values of Jomsborg, even as the fortress itself faded into memory. And Jomsborg itself. What became of that legendary stronghold in the years after Hjörungavágr? The sagas grow vague on this point, their authors more interested in the heroic deaths than in the mundane decline that followed. But some facts can be pieced together from various sources. The fortress did not fall immediately. A garrison remained, maintaining the traditions as best they could with drastically reduced numbers. New recruits continued to arrive, drawn by the legend, even as the reality grew increasingly hollow. For a time, it seemed possible that Jomsborg might recover, that the Brotherhood might rebuild itself into something approximating its former glory. But the world was changing. The political landscape that had allowed the Jomsvikings to thrive, the fragmented Scandinavian kingdoms, the constant warfare that created demand for elite mercenaries, was slowly consolidating. Denmark was becoming a unified state under increasingly powerful kings who had no interest in tolerating an independent military force on their territory. The days of the freebooting Viking Brotherhood were numbered, regardless of what happened at Hjörungavágr. The final fate of Jomsborg itself is lost to history. Some accounts suggest the fortress was destroyed by the Wends, the Slavic peoples who had always resented the Viking presence on their coast. Others claim it was simply abandoned, its warriors drifting away as the economic model that had sustained them collapsed. A few later sources mention a place called Jomneda or Jomneda in approximately the same location, suggesting that some settlement persisted even after the Jomsviking era ended. By the middle of the 11th century, the Jomsvikings had passed from history into legend. The fortress, if it still existed, had become just another coastal settlement. The warriors who had once terrified kingdoms were scattered, dead, or absorbed into other military traditions. The great experiment in martial brotherhood had run its course. Yet the legend only grew stronger with time. The sagas that told their story were composed in the 12th and 13th centuries, 200 years or more after the events they described. By then, the Jomsvikings had become symbols of an age that seemed almost impossibly heroic to later generations. The Vikings had been Christianized, their old ways abandoned, their fierce independence constrained by feudal structures and church authority. Looking back at the Jomsvikings was like peering through a window into a vanished world, a world where men lived and died by simple codes, where personal courage mattered more than political calculation, where death could be faced with a joke on one's lips and contempt in one's heart. The saga authors did not merely record what they knew of Jomsviking history. They shaped it, emphasized certain elements, downplayed others, added dramatic embellishments that transformed history into something closer to scripture. The Jomsvikings of the sagas are more than human. They are archetypes, embodiments of warrior virtue that later generations could admire and aspire to, even as they lived very different lives. This transformation raises important questions for anyone seeking to understand the historical Jomsvikings. How much of what the sagas tell us actually happened? How much is literary invention designed to entertain audiences and promote particular values? The boundary between fact and fiction in these sources is not always clear, and scholars have spent centuries trying to separate the two. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: some kind of Viking warrior brotherhood did exist, probably based somewhere on the southern Baltic coast, probably during the late 10th century. This brotherhood developed a distinctive culture emphasizing martial skill, personal loyalty, and indifference to death. It participated in various military campaigns, including an attack on Norway that ended in disaster at Hjörungavágr. And its legend far outlived its historical existence, shaping Scandinavian cultural memory for generations after the last Jomsviking had gone to whatever reward awaited him beyond the grave. The questions multiply when we try to probe deeper. Where exactly was Jomsborg? The answer remains uncertain. The southern Baltic coast stretches for hundreds of miles, a labyrinth of islands, river mouths, and shifting sandbars that has confounded sailors and cartographers for millennia. Somewhere along this coast, probably at the mouth of the Oder River, where it empties into what is now the Sjechin Lagoon, the fortress of Jomsborg once stood. Or perhaps it stood elsewhere entirely. The truth is that despite centuries of searching, despite archaeological expeditions and archival research and the application of increasingly sophisticated technology, no one has ever definitively located the site. This absence haunts the study of the Jomsvikings like a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. a fortress large enough to shelter 300 longships, a harbor that served as the base for one of the most famous warrior brotherhoods in Norse history. Such a place should have left traces. Stone foundations, harbor works, the detritus of decades of military occupation. Yet the material evidence remains frustratingly elusive, scattered across multiple possible sites, none of which has produced the conclusive proof that scholars seek. The most commonly proposed location is Wolin, a Polish island at the mouth of the Oder that medieval Arab and German sources describe as a major trading center. The geography fits reasonably well with saga descriptions, and archaeological excavations have revealed substantial Viking Age settlement. Wolin was clearly an important place in the 10th and 11th centuries, a cosmopolitan trading hub where Scandinavians, Slavs, and merchants from across Europe mingled and did business. Some researchers have argued that this thriving commercial center was Jomsborg, or at least the settlement that grew up around the Jomsviking fortress. But the identification raises as many questions as it answers. The sagas describe Jomsborg as first and foremost a military installation, a fortress dedicated to warfare rather than trade. Wolin, by contrast, appears to have been primarily a merchant town, its wealth derived from commerce rather than conquest. The two images do not fit together easily. Perhaps the Jomsvikings maintained a military compound within or adjacent to the larger settlement. Perhaps the sagas exaggerated the martial character of the place for dramatic effect. Or perhaps Wolin and Jomsborg were two different locations entirely, and the similarity of names in some sources is mere coincidence or later confusion. Other proposed sites include various locations along the German and Polish coast, Uzdam, Kamin Pomorski, even places as far afield as the Danish islands. Each identification has its advocates, each can marshal certain evidence in its favor, and none has achieved anything approaching scholarly consensus. The fortress of Jomsborg remains, like so much else about the Brotherhood it housed, tantalizingly out of reach. This uncertainty extends to the very existence of the Jomsvikings as the sagas describe them. Some historians have argued that the Brotherhood was essentially a literary invention, a romantic idealization created by later authors rather than a genuine historical institution. The saga accounts, on this view, tell us more about 13th century Icelandic values than about 10th century Scandinavian realities. The Jomsvikings were a fantasy, a wishful projection of what warriors might be if freed from the messiness of ordinary life. The argument has force. The saga portrait of the Jomsvikings does seem almost too perfect, too neatly organized, too dramatically satisfying to be entirely true. The strict code of conduct, the complete celibacy, the perfect equality among warriors of vastly different origins, these elements read more like a philosopher's thought experiment than a working military organization. Real institutions are messy, full of exceptions and compromises and human weakness. The Jomsviking Code, as the sagas present, it leaves no room for such messiness. Yet dismissing the Jomsvikings as pure fiction seems equally unsatisfying. The sources that mention them are numerous and varied, including not just Icelandic sagas but also Danish chronicles, Norwegian histories, and scattered references in other medieval texts. While these sources often contradict each other on details, they agree on the basic outline: a warrior brotherhood based on the southern Baltic coast, active during the late 10th century, involved in various military campaigns in Scandinavia. Such consistency across independent sources suggests that something historical underlies the legend, even if that something has been heavily embellished over time. The most plausible interpretation lies somewhere between the extremes. There was almost certainly a real Jomsviking brotherhood, a group of warriors who lived together, fought together, and developed a distinctive culture that contemporaries found noteworthy. But the brotherhood, as it actually existed, was probably smaller, less perfectly organized, and more closely entangled with ordinary political and economic life than the sagas suggest. Later authors took this historical kernel and elaborated it into something grander, something that satisfied their artistic and ideological purposes. The Jomsvikings of legend are thus like figures seen through a distorting lens, recognizably based on something real, but transformed in ways that make it difficult to determine what that something actually was. This interpretive challenge is not unique to the Jomsvikings. It applies to virtually every aspect of the Viking Age, a period known to us primarily through sources composed long after the events they describe. The great sagas that form our richest narrative sources were written down in Iceland during the 12th and 13th centuries, often dealing with events that had occurred 2 or 3 centuries earlier. The authors of these works were Christians living in a society that had long since abandoned the Old Norse religion. They were educated men, familiar with continental European literature and influenced by its conventions. When they told stories of the pagan Viking past, they necessarily filtered those stories through their own cultural lenses. The result is a body of literature that is simultaneously indispensable and deeply problematic. We cannot understand the Viking Age without the sagas, yet we cannot simply trust them as straightforward historical accounts. Every detail must be evaluated, compared with other sources where possible, weighed against what we know from archaeology and other disciplines. The process is painstaking, often frustrating, and rarely yields the kind of certainty that we might wish for. We must learn to live with ambiguity, to hold multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously, to resist the temptation to construct neat narratives where the evidence supports only messy ones. This is particularly true when dealing with institutions like the Jomsvikings. We can say with confidence that Viking Age Scandinavia produced various forms of warrior organization, from the retinues that served individual kings and chieftains to the great armies that invaded England and Francia. Some of these organizations developed distinctive cultures and codes of conduct, marking their members as set apart from ordinary society. The Jomsvikings fit within this broader pattern, representing one particularly striking example of how warriors might organize themselves and understand their place in the world. What made the Jomsvikings distinctive, or at least what later sources claimed made them distinctive, was the completeness of their separation from ordinary life. Most warrior bands maintained connections to families, to home communities, to the agricultural economy that fed everyone. Even the most dedicated fighters expected to settle down eventually, to acquire land and marry and raise children who would carry on their names. The Jomsviking Code, as the sagas describe it, rejected all of this. The fortress was not a temporary gathering place, but a permanent home. The Brotherhood was not a phase of life, but a total identity. The warrior who entered Jomsborg was supposed to leave his former self behind to become something new and separate from the world he had known. This totality gives the Jomsviking legend its peculiar power. Most warrior stories involve men who fight bravely, but remain recognizably human, embedded in webs of relationship and obligation that we can understand and identify with. The Jomsvikings, as the sagas present them, transcend these ordinary entanglements. They exist purely as warriors, their identities reduced to their capacity for violence and their willingness to face death. This makes them alien in certain ways, harder to relate to as full human beings. But it also makes them mythic, gives them a grandeur that ordinary fighters cannot achieve. The celibacy rule illustrates this logic particularly clearly. By renouncing women, and by extension, the entire domain of domestic life, of procreation and nurture, and the building of households, the Jomsvikings were supposed to focus entirely on warfare. No distractions, no competing loyalties, no softening of the warrior spirit by the tenderness that family life might inspire. The result was supposed to be warriors of unmatched ferocity, men who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Whether any real group of men actually lived this way for any extended period is another question. Human beings are social creatures, driven by needs that no code of conduct can entirely suppress. Celibacy has been a feature of many religious and military orders throughout history, from Buddhist monasteries to medieval Christian military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers. But these later orders developed elaborate institutional structures to support celibacy, including constant supervision, regular confession, and severe penalties for violations. They also existed within a broader religious framework that gave meaning to sexual renunciation, presenting it as a sacrifice offered to God rather than merely a practical measure to enhance military effectiveness. The Jomsvikings, if they existed as the sagas describe them, would have lacked these supports. Their celibacy would have been purely practical, designed to prevent domestic entanglements rather than to achieve spiritual merit. It would have been enforced only by the pressure of one's peers and by the threat of expulsion from the Brotherhood. One wonders how long such a system could have lasted, how many exceptions were quietly made, how many violations were overlooked in the name of maintaining an ideal that reality could not quite sustain. The age restrictions in the Jomsviking Code point to similar tensions between ideal and reality. The sagas tell us that no man younger than 18 or older than 50 could join the Brotherhood. These limits make military sense. Too young and a warrior lacks the physical development and emotional maturity for serious combat. Too old, and he becomes a liability rather than an asset. But enforcing such limits would have required mechanisms that the sagas do not describe. How was age verified in a world without birth certificates or systematic record-keeping? How were aging warriors removed from the Brotherhood when they passed 50? Were they expelled, pensioned off, allowed to die in battle before their decline became too obvious? These practical questions receive no answers in our sources because the sources are not concerned with practical administration. They are telling a story about heroic warriors, not writing an operations manual for a military organization. The gaps in their accounts reflect their literary purposes rather than the historical realities they were describing. We cannot fill those gaps through speculation alone, however reasonable our speculations might seem. What we can do is situate the Jomsvikings within the broader context of Viking Age military culture, drawing on what we know from other sources to illuminate what the sagas leave obscure. The warriors who joined Jomsborg, whoever they were and however their organization actually functioned, came from a world that had developed sophisticated techniques for waging war. They inherited traditions of shipbuilding, weapon craft, and tactical organization that represented centuries of accumulated experience. They belonged to a culture that valued martial prowess above almost everything else, that celebrated the warrior who died bravely and scorned the one who fled. This culture produced warriors of genuine skill and courage. Whatever exaggerations the sagas contain, they are building on a foundation of real military achievement. The Vikings dominated northern European warfare for nearly 3 centuries, raiding coasts from Ireland to the Byzantine Empire, conquering kingdoms and establishing settlements across a vast geographic range. This was not accomplished through blind ferocity alone. It required organization, logistics, intelligence gathering, and tactical flexibility. The Vikings were professional warriors in every meaningful sense, and the Jomsvikings, the real Jomsvikings, whoever they were, represented an especially concentrated expression of this professionalism. Their weapons were the tools of their trade, crafted with the same care that any skilled artisan devotes to the instruments of his craft. The Viking sword, in particular, was a masterpiece of medieval metallurgy. Pattern-welded blades combined different types of steel to achieve both flexibility and a hard cutting edge. The different metals twisted together and hammered flat to create distinctive patterns that ran through the metal like frozen rivers. These weapons were treasured possessions, passed down through generations or buried with their owners, too precious to leave for enemies to plunder. The making of such a sword was a weeks-long process requiring the skills of specialist smiths. Iron had to be smelted from bog ore, a labor-intensive process that produced metal of variable quality. The best iron was set aside for weapons, carefully refined to remove impurities that would weaken the finished blade. Different grades of steel were then combined, their varying carbon content giving different properties, hardness here, flexibility there, that together created a weapon superior to what any single type of steel could produce. The smith worked at his forge with hammer and tongs, heating the metal until it glowed orange-white, folding and twisting and hammering until the different steels were thoroughly integrated. The blade emerged gradually from this process, taking shape through countless cycles of heating and hammering. When the basic form was achieved, the smith began the long process of grinding and polishing, removing the rough surface left by the hammer to reveal the smooth metal beneath. The pattern-welded core showed through this polished surface, the different steels visible as subtle variations in color and texture that gave each blade a unique appearance. Finally came the hilting. Crossguards and pommels were cast from bronze or iron, often decorated with silver or gold inlay in the intricate interlace patterns that Viking artists favored. The grip was wrapped in leather or wire, shaped to fit the hand. When complete, the sword was a functional weapon, a work of art, and a symbol of its owner's status all in one. Such a blade might be given a name, addressed in poetry, treated almost as a companion rather than a mere object. The Jomsvikings would have possessed swords like these, passed down from fathers who could no longer use them or taken from enemies who no longer needed them. They would have cared for these weapons obsessively, keeping them sharp and clean and ready for use at a moment's notice. A warrior's sword was his life. Without it, he was merely a man. But with it, he was transformed into something more dangerous than any unarmed creature that walked the earth. Axes were perhaps even more common among Viking warriors, and the Jomsvikings would have included many skilled axemen in their ranks. The great Danish broadaxe was a fearsome weapon, its wide blade capable of cleaving through shields and helmets, its long haft giving reach that a sword could not match. In skilled hands, an axe could be used to hook an opponent's shield, pulling it aside to expose the body beneath. It could smash through defensive formations, its heavy blade generating momentum that no parry could entirely absorb. But the axe required different skills than the sword. It was slower, less maneuverable, committed its wielder to more predictable patterns of attack. A good axeman learned to compensate for these limitations, using footwork and timing to create openings that the weapon's power could exploit. He learned to recover quickly from missed strokes, to use the haft for blocking and striking, to turn the weapon's apparent clumsiness into a kind of brutal efficiency. The spear was the most common weapon of all, cheaper to produce than swords or fine axes, effective in the hands of warriors with less extensive training. A spearman could fight from behind the shield wall, thrusting at enemies while his companions protected his flanks. He could throw his weapon at charging opponents, disrupting their formation before the lines clashed. He could use his spear's reach to keep sword-armed enemies at a distance, striking at them before they could close to their preferred range. The Jomsvikings would have trained with all these weapons and more. Their code, as the sagas describe it, emphasized comprehensive martial skill. A Jomsviking was supposed to be proficient with every weapon of war, able to adapt to whatever circumstances the chaos of battle presented. This versatility would have required years of practice, drilling techniques until they became reflexive, sparring with companions to learn how different opponents fought and how to counter their styles. Such training created bonds between warriors that transcended ordinary friendship. Men who had sweated and bled together in practice bouts, who had pushed each other to greater skill through friendly competition, who had seen each other at their best and worst. These men understood each other in ways that no outsider could fully grasp. They communicated in abbreviated gestures and glances, reading each other's intentions without need for words. In battle, this understanding translated into tactical coordination that no amount of shouted orders could achieve. The shield wall depended on such understanding. Fighting shoulder to shoulder with companions, each man's safety depended on the man next to him. If one warrior broke formation, the entire line could collapse, exposing everyone to destruction. The discipline required to hold position while enemies hacked at your shield, to trust that your companions would do the same, to suppress the primal urge to flee or to charge forward. This discipline could only be developed through long training and absolute mutual trust. The Jomsvikings at Hjörungavágr demonstrated this discipline in their final stand. Surrounded, outnumbered, facing certain death, they did not break and run. They held their formation as long as formation could be held, then fought on in smaller groups as the line fragmented, then fought alone when no companions remained. Their training and their code sustained them past the point where ordinary warriors would have sought escape or surrender. This is what their executioners witnessed in the aftermath of battle, not broken men begging for mercy, but warriors who had simply exchanged one form of combat for another. They could not defeat their enemies with weapons, so they defeated them with words and attitudes. They could not avoid death, so they embraced it, transformed it from a punishment into a performance. In doing so, they wrote themselves into legend, ensuring that their names would be remembered long after the names of their victorious enemies had been forgotten. The morning after Hjörungavágr dawned gray and cold, the kind of iron-colored sky that turns the Norwegian fjords into mirrors of slate. Blood still stained the rocks along the shoreline, mixing with seawater in pools that would take days to fade. Broken ships listed in the shallows, their masts canted at angles that spoke of violence. And somewhere on that shore, the survivors of the Jomsviking force awaited their fate. The sources disagree on exact numbers. Some accounts suggest that fewer than 24 Jomsvikings survived the battle to face execution. Others place the number higher, at 30 or more warriors taken alive in the final moments of combat. What the sources agree upon is the manner of their deaths and the way those deaths transformed military defeat into something far more enduring than victory. Håkon Jarl, whose forces had broken the Jomsviking fleet, now faced a decision that carried weight beyond the immediate circumstances. These men had sailed to Norway intending to kill him and claim his territories for a Danish king. They had burned settlements along the coast, slaughtered his people, threatened everything he had built. Norse custom permitted, even expected, harsh treatment of captured enemies. Execution was not merely acceptable, it was the norm. But the manner of execution, the ritual surrounding it, the messages it sent to observers both present and future, these details required careful consideration. The Jarl chose public execution by beheading, carried out by a single executioner in front of assembled witnesses. Each Jomsviking would be brought forward individually, would kneel, and would receive the sword stroke that ended his life. The audience would include Håkon's warriors, local chieftains, perhaps common folk from nearby settlements. The spectacle would demonstrate the Jarl's power, his willingness to deal harshly with those who threatened his realm, his complete victory over men who had seemed invincible. But spectacles can be commandeered, performances can be hijacked, and the Jomsvikings, it seems, understood theater as well as they understood warfare. The first warrior was brought to the execution ground, his hands bound behind his back, his wounds still fresh from the previous day's fighting. The executioner stood ready with a sharp sword. Håkon's men watched, expecting to see fear, hoping perhaps for pleas or tears that would validate their triumph. Instead, the Jomsviking faced his death with an expression that the sagas describe as cheerful. He made a joke. The specific words vary between accounts, but the tone is consistent. Something about the quality of Norwegian hospitality, or the inconvenience of the weather, or the executioner's technique. Then he knelt, and the sword fell, and his head rolled across the stony ground. The second warrior approached with similar composure, and the third. Each found something to say, some observation that undercut the solemnity of the occasion, that transformed the killing ground into a stage where the dying held more attention than those wielding power over them. They did not weep. They did not beg. They did not even seem particularly distressed. They went to their deaths as men might go to a feast, with anticipation perhaps, but not fear. The saga of the Jomsvikings preserves several of these final exchanges in detail, though we cannot know how accurately the words were recorded or whether they represent embellishment by later storytellers. One warrior reportedly asked the executioner to strike quickly and cleanly, because he had a wager with a companion about whether a man could perceive his own beheading. He wanted to know the answer. Another commented on the quality of the sword, praising its edge with the professional appreciation of a fellow craftsman. A third requested that his long hair be held out of the way so that the blood would not mat it. He had always been proud of his hair and saw no reason to abandon that pride simply because he was about to die. These details may be legendary rather than historical. Storytellers across cultures have always placed clever last words in the mouths of dying heroes. But even if the specific phrases are inventions, the general pattern they describe aligns with what we know about Jomsviking culture and the broader warrior ethos of the Viking Age. These were men who had built their identities around contempt for death, who had sworn oaths that explicitly forbade showing fear, who understood that reputation extended beyond the grave. Their behavior at execution represented the logical culmination of everything they had trained for, believed in, and lived by. The turning point in the execution, the moment that would echo through saga literature and historical memory, came with a young warrior named Vagn Åkesson. Unlike some of his older companions, Vagn was not merely resigned to death. He actively challenged it, playing with his captors in ways that demonstrated how completely he had internalized the Jomsviking code. According to the most detailed accounts, Vagn was beautiful in the manner that sagas value, tall, well-formed, with hair the color of gold. He was also young, perhaps no more than 18 winters old, though he had fought with the ferocity of a man twice his age. When his turn came, he approached the execution site with the same nonchalance his companions had displayed, but he added a twist that no one anticipated. As he knelt and the executioner raised his sword, Vagn suddenly jerked his head forward at the precise moment of the stroke. The movement was slight, but perfectly timed. The sword, aimed at his neck, instead struck the man holding Vagn's hair, severing the holder's hands and continuing its arc to kill a bystander who stood too close. In the chaos that followed, Vagn looked up at his captors and asked, with what the sagas describe as genuine curiosity, whether the sword had touched his hair. The audacity of this act stunned the assembled witnesses. Here was a man about to die, who had transformed his execution into an attack, who had used his enemy's own ritual against them, who had turned his last moment of life into a final demonstration of warrior skill. The timing required was extraordinary. To anticipate the sword stroke precisely, to move at exactly the right instant, to achieve the result he intended rather than simply dying in a slightly different position. It was, in its way, a perfect expression of everything the Jomsvikings claimed to be. Håkon Jarl's son, Eirik, witnessed this display. What he saw moved him in ways that cut through the hatred that battle and blood feud typically engendered between enemies. Here was a warrior worth preserving. Here was courage that deserved recognition. Eirik intervened, demanding that Vagn be spared. The young Jomsviking had earned his life through the very qualities his captors admired: skill, daring, and absolute composure in the face of death. Vagn Åkesson survived the execution of his companions. According to the sagas, he eventually reconciled with his former enemies, married into Eirik Jarl's family, and lived to old age. His descendants would claim him as an ancestor, drawing prestige from his blood connection to the legendary Brotherhood. Whether this tale is historically accurate or a later invention designed to connect prominent families to heroic lineages, it reveals something important about how the Jomsvikings were remembered. Even in defeat, even in death, they commanded respect that transcended ordinary enmity. They were not merely enemies to be destroyed, but exemplars of martial virtue that their conquerors wished to emulate and incorporate. The other warriors died, one by one, until the stony ground was soaked with their blood. Not one of them is recorded as having shown fear. Not one begged for mercy. Not one broke the code that had defined their lives. In death, as in life, they remained Jomsvikings, members of an elite brotherhood bound by oaths stronger than the fear of dying. The immediate aftermath of Hjörungavágr left Jomsborg weakened, but not destroyed. The fortress still stood on its island at the mouth of the Oder. Warriors who had not sailed with Sigvaldi's fleet still manned its walls. The political and military relationships that had sustained the Brotherhood, their connections to Danish royalty, their alliances with Baltic powers, their reputation as the most effective mercenaries in Northern Europe, remained theoretically intact. But the battle had shattered something essential: the loss of so many experienced warriors, the death of commanders who had led the Brotherhood for years, the simple demonstration that Jomsvikings could be beaten. These factors combined to diminish the Brotherhood in ways that would prove difficult to reverse. The decade following the battle saw Jomsborg continue as a functioning military force, but with reduced scope and ambition. Sigvaldi, who had fled the battle, remained in command of the remnant Brotherhood, though his reputation never recovered from the perception that he had abandoned his men to destruction. The sagas treat him harshly, describing his flight as a betrayal that violated everything the Jomsvikings claimed to stand for. Whether this judgment is fair, Whether Sigvaldi fled from cowardice or from tactical calculation, whether he hoped to preserve forces for future campaigns or simply valued his life above his honor, we cannot know with certainty. What we know is that his name became synonymous with disgrace, a cautionary tale about what happened when a Jomsviking prioritized survival over the code. The political landscape of Scandinavia continued to shift in ways that undermined Jomsborg's position. The Danish monarchy, which had provided crucial patronage to the Brotherhood, faced its own challenges and complications. Svein Forkbeard, the king whose ambitions had driven the Norwegian campaign, continued to pursue expansion and revenge, but his attention increasingly focused westward, toward England, where the weak king Ethelred offered opportunities for conquest and plunder that Norway could not match. The great Danish invasions of England that would culminate in Svein's brief seizure of the English throne, and his son Knut's long reign drew resources and attention away from Baltic affairs. Jomsborg, once central to Danish military strategy, became increasingly peripheral. The Brotherhood's recruitment faced challenges as well. The catastrophic losses at Hjörungavágr had eliminated not just warriors, but repositories of institutional knowledge, the captains and veterans who understood how Jomsborg functioned, who embodied its traditions, who could train new recruits in both combat skills and the less tangible qualities that made a Jomsviking different from an ordinary warrior. Replacing these men required time and effort that the diminished Brotherhood may not have possessed. Young warriors seeking glory had to weigh the prestige of joining Jomsborg against the recent demonstration that this prestige could lead to death on Norwegian shores. Yet, the Brotherhood endured. Throughout the late 10th century and into the early 11th, references to Jomsvikings continue to appear in various sources. They participated in subsequent conflicts, hired out their services to kings and chieftains, maintained Jomsborg as a functioning military installation. The scale of their operations had shrunk, the fear their name inspired had diminished, but the institution itself survived. This survival speaks to the depth of the foundations that Palnatoke and his successors had laid. The Brotherhood was more than its individual members. It was a system, a set of practices and beliefs that could be transmitted to new generations even as old warriors died. The final decades of Jomsborg's existence remain frustratingly unclear in the historical record. Different sources offer conflicting accounts of when and how the fortress finally fell, who delivered the death blow to the Brotherhood, what became of the warriors who remained. Some accounts suggest that the Polish Duke Bolesław Thrundahar destroyed Jomsborg around 1043, incorporating its territory into his expanding realm and eliminating a mercenary force that had become more nuisance than asset. Others place the end earlier or later, attribute it to different causes, describe different final chapters. What seems clear is that by the middle of the 11th century, Jomsborg had ceased to exist as a meaningful military or political entity. The fortress may have stood longer, physical structures outlast the institutions that create them, but the Brotherhood, the code, the way of life that had made the Jomsvikings unique, all of this had passed into memory and legend. The last men who had taken the oaths, who had lived by the code, who had known the taste of salt spray on their lips as their longships cut through Baltic waters, these men grew old and died, taking their direct knowledge with them. But here's the paradox that defines the Jomsviking legacy. Their defeat at Hjörungavágr, their death on Norwegian execution grounds, their eventual disappearance from the stage of history, none of this diminished their reputation. Instead, their end became the foundation of their immortality. The sagas that preserved their story focused overwhelmingly on their final battle and their manner of dying. The courage they displayed, the jokes they made, the absolute refusal to show fear. These moments resonated through centuries of storytelling in ways that their victories, however impressive, never matched. This is not coincidental. The saga authors who compiled and elaborated the Jomsviking traditions were working within a culture that valued heroic defeat as much as victory. The Norse mythological system itself centered on Ragnarok, the final battle in which the gods themselves would die, fighting against the forces of chaos. Odin, the highest god, gathered fallen warriors to his hall precisely because they had died in combat, Their deaths, not their victories, qualified them for eternal honor. The Jomsvikings, dying with laughter on their lips, fit perfectly into this framework. They became exemplars of the ideal that the sagas wished to celebrate. The broader Viking Age was drawing to a close during the period of Jomsborg's decline. The forces that had driven Norse expansion for 3 centuries, population pressure, political fragmentation, the allure of wealthy targets in Christian Europe, were being replaced by different dynamics. Christianization was spreading through Scandinavia, bringing new values and new institutions that would transform warrior culture from the foundation up. The kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were consolidating, replacing the patchwork of jarls and chieftains with centralized monarchies that had less need for independent mercenary brotherhoods. The opportunities for raiding and conquest that had sustained Viking military culture were shrinking as targets became better defended and trade offered alternatives to plunder. In this context, the Jomsvikings represented the end of something as much as its exemplification. They were perhaps the purest expression of Viking warrior culture, organized, disciplined, utterly devoted to the martial values that had shaped Northern Europe for centuries. Their passing marked not just the end of a specific institution, but the closing of an era. The world that had created them, that had needed them, that had celebrated what they represented, was transforming into something that had no place for men who lived and died by the old codes. Yet transformation is not the same as forgetting. The men who wrote the sagas, who transmitted oral traditions through the generations, who eventually committed these stories to parchment in the 13th century. These men lived in a Christian Scandinavia that was, in many ways, utterly different from the world of the Jomsvikings, but they looked back on their pagan ancestors with a mixture of censure and admiration. They condemned the old religion, acknowledged the superiority of Christian civilization, accepted the narrative of progress and conversion. At the same time, they could not help but be moved by the courage, the loyalty, the sheer ferocity of men like the Jomsvikings. Something in those old stories spoke to values that transcended religious change. The Jomsviking saga, the primary narrative source for the Brotherhood's history, was compiled in its written form around the 13th century, roughly 200 years after the events it describes. This temporal distance raises obvious questions about accuracy. How much of what the saga reports actually happened? How much represents later invention, embellishment, or misunderstanding? Scholars have debated these questions for generations without reaching consensus. What we can say is that the saga represents what medieval Icelanders wanted to believe about the Jomsvikings, and in some ways, this is as valuable as knowing what the Jomsvikings actually were. The saga presents an idealized vision of warrior brotherhood, of absolute loyalty, of contempt for death. It presents this vision as admirable, as worthy of preservation and celebration. The men who compiled the saga saw in the Jomsvikings qualities they wished to honor, values they recognized as part of their own heritage, even if their own times had moved beyond them. The saga also preserves details that ring true precisely because they resist idealization. The account of Sigvaldi's flight, for example, undercuts the narrative of universal Jomsviking heroism. If the saga authors had invented the story entirely, they might well have given Sigvaldi a more honorable role, had him die fighting alongside his men, perhaps, or at least provided some excuse for his absence from the final slaughter. Instead, they preserved the memory of his disgrace, suggesting that this element of the story had roots in actual tradition rather than later invention. Similarly, the variations between different versions of the saga suggest a complex process of transmission rather than unified literary creation. Different manuscripts preserve different details, different orderings of events, different emphases. This variation is precisely what we would expect if oral traditions were being recorded by different compilers, working from different informants. A single author inventing the story whole cloth would likely produce a more consistent narrative. The physical setting that the saga describes, the fortress of Jomsborg, the Baltic coastline, the political geography of the region, aligns with what archaeology and other sources tell us about the late Viking Age. The saga authors knew their geography, knew the political realities of the period, knew the kinds of ships and weapons their ancestors had used. This accuracy and detail lends credibility to other elements of the narrative, even when those elements cannot be independently verified. But ultimately, the question of historical accuracy may matter less than the question of cultural significance. The Jomsvikings, whether they existed exactly as the sagas describe or whether their story represents an idealized composite of various warrior traditions, came to embody something that Scandinavian culture wished to preserve. They became a symbol, a touchstone, a reference point for discussions of courage, loyalty, and honor that continued long after the last man who might have called himself a Jomsviking had died. This symbolic function expanded beyond Scandinavia itself. As knowledge of Norse history and mythology spread through European culture in subsequent centuries, the Jomsvikings acquired broader significance. Romantic-era writers and artists, fascinated by the perceived nobility of pre-Christian warrior cultures, found in the Jomsviking story a perfect expression of their ideals. The image of doomed warriors facing death with laughter, of a brotherhood sustained by oaths stronger than any force that could be brought against them, of men who chose honor over survival. This image resonated with notions of heroism that transcended its specific cultural origins. The military applications of the Jomsviking model also drew attention from later observers. Professional military units throughout history have grappled with the same challenges the Jomsvikings apparently solved. How to create loyalty that transcends individual self-interest, how to train men to fight as unified bodies rather than collections of individuals, how to sustain morale in the face of overwhelming odds. The Jomsviking Code, with its emphasis on shared standards and mutual obligation, offered one answer to these perennial questions. Military historians and theorists have examined the Brotherhood as an early example of professional military organization, comparing its structure and methods to later developments in European warfare. The night before Hjörungavágr, as the Jomsviking fleet rode at anchor and the warriors prepared for the battle they knew was coming, what thoughts passed through their minds? We can never know for certain. The sagas preserve actions and words, but not inner states. Yet we can imagine, based on what we know about their culture and training, the mental preparation these men would have undertaken. They would have checked their weapons one final time, running fingers along sword edges, testing the bindings on axe hafts, ensuring that every piece of equipment was ready for the violence ahead. They would have eaten whatever food was available, knowing that battle on an empty stomach meant weakness and slow reactions. They would have spoken with companions, perhaps sharing memories of past fights or speculating about what the morrow would bring. Some would have prayed to the old gods, to Odin, who received the battle slain, to Thor, whose hammer protected warriors, to the Valkyries, who chose which fighters would fall and which would stand. And beneath all of this practical and spiritual preparation, they would have confronted the central reality of their profession, that tomorrow they might die. This confrontation was not new. They faced it before every battle, every raid, every voyage into dangerous waters. But something about Hjörungavágr may have felt different. The scale of the forces arrayed against them, the narrowness of the fjord that limited their tactical options, the determination of an enemy fighting to defend his homeland. All of this suggested that the coming fight would extract a heavy price. The Jomsviking Code, however it was actually formulated, addressed precisely this situation. It told them that fear was inappropriate, that death was not to be avoided at the cost of honor, that their reputations would outlast their bodies. These beliefs, internalized through years of training and reinforcement, provided psychological armor against the terror that battle naturally inspired. The men who would die laughing the next day had spent years preparing for that moment. When it came, they were ready. The weapons they carried, the ships that bore them, the companions who fought beside them, the code that bound them together. All of these elements combined to create warriors, unlike any others in the Viking world. The Jomsvikings were not simply soldiers or raiders or mercenaries, though they were all of these things. They were members of an elite brotherhood that demanded everything from them and offered, in return, an identity that transcended ordinary existence. To be a Jomsviking was to belong to something larger than oneself, to participate in a tradition that reached back to the founding of the fortress and forward to whatever future the Brotherhood would create. That future, as it turned out, would be measured in legend rather than years. The Battle of Hjörungavágr and the execution that followed became the defining moments of Jomsviking history, the events that subsequent generations would remember and celebrate. The victories they had won, the wealth they had accumulated, the political influence they had exercised, all of this faded in comparison to their manner of dying. They became, in death, more than they had been in life. The dawn came gray and cold over Hjörungavágr, the light spreading slowly across waters that would soon turn red with blood. Mist clung to the surface of the fjord, wrapping the anchored fleets in a shroud that muffled sound and obscured vision. The Jomsvikings stirred from whatever rest they had managed, their bodies stiff from sleeping in armor, their breath forming clouds in the chill morning air. Across the water, invisible but present, Earl Haakon's forces were doing the same. Thousands of Norwegian warriors preparing for the battle that would decide the fate of their homeland. The numbers favored the defenders. Later accounts would claim that Haakon commanded somewhere between 180 and 300 ships, while the Jomsvikings brought perhaps 60 vessels to the fight. Even accounting for the exaggeration common to saga literature, the disparity was real. The Norwegians had called upon every ally, every vassal, every man who could hold a weapon. This was not a mere skirmish over trade rights or political influence. This was an invasion, and they responded accordingly. The Jomsvikings, for all their skill and reputation, faced an enemy that outnumbered them perhaps 3 or 4 to 1. Sigvaldi Strut Haraldsson commanded the Jomsviking fleet, though the degree to which the other jarls deferred to his leadership remains unclear from the sources. Bui Digri controlled his own contingent, as did Vagn Åkesson, the young warrior who would later become the most celebrated survivor of the battle and its aftermath. The Jomsviking force was divided into 3 divisions, each responsible for engaging a portion of the Norwegian fleet. This division of command would prove significant as the battle developed. The fighting began when the mist lifted enough for the fleets to see each other clearly. There were no elaborate maneuvers, no attempts at tactical surprise. The narrow confines of the fjord left little room for such sophistication. Instead, the two forces rowed toward each other across the gray water, oars churning, shields raised along the gunwales, warriors standing ready in the fighting platforms that every longship carried. The sounds of the advance, the creak of oars, the splash of water, the rhythmic chanting that kept rowers synchronized, filled the fjord with a terrible music. When the ships collided, the battle proper began. Viking naval combat was essentially land warfare conducted on floating platforms. Ships grappled together, bound by ropes and iron hooks, forming great floating battlefields where men fought with sword and axe and spear. The sea beneath them heaved with the swell, making footing treacherous, but the warriors on both sides had trained for exactly these conditions. They planted their feet and swung their weapons and screamed their war cries as blood began to flow. The Jomsvikings fought with the fury that their reputation demanded. Bui Digri, the great warrior whose name meant the stout, carved a path through the Norwegian ranks with his axe, his massive frame shrugging off blows that would have felled lesser men. Vagn Åkesson, barely out of adolescence, proved his worth with sword work that even his enemies would later praise. The Jomsviking veterans, men who had spent years perfecting the art of killing, demonstrated why they were feared throughout the north. They gave no ground willingly, contested every deck, made the Norwegians pay dearly for every ship they captured. But numbers told. As the hours passed and the sun climbed higher over the fjord, the Norwegian advantage began to assert itself. When one Jomsviking fell, there was no replacement waiting to take his position. When a Norwegian went down, another warrior immediately stepped into the gap. The mathematics of attrition, which had doomed so many elite forces throughout history, worked against the Brotherhood with remorseless efficiency. They could kill 2 or 3 enemies for every man they lost and still find themselves losing the battle. The accounts describe Haakon, at some point during the fighting, making a sacrifice to ensure victory. Different sources tell different versions of this tale. In some, he offers his youngest son to the gods. In others, the sacrifice is more ambiguous. What seems clear is that the Norwegians believed divine intervention was necessary to overcome the Jomsvikings, which testifies to how fiercely the Brotherhood was fighting. Even with their advantages in numbers and position, even with the fury of men defending their homeland, the Norwegians could not simply overwhelm their enemies through courage and steel alone. They needed the gods, and the gods, it seemed, answered. A sudden storm blew in from the sea, driving hail and sleet into the faces of the Jomsvikings. The sagas describe the storm as supernatural in origin, a divine response to Hakon's sacrifice. Modern readers might attribute it to the changeable weather of the Norwegian coast, but the effect was the same regardless of cause. The Jomsvikings, fighting into the wind and rain, found their vision obscured and their movements hampered. The Norwegians, with the storm at their backs, pressed their advantage. It was at this moment that Sigvaldi made his fateful decision. Seeing the battle turn against them, facing an enemy that outnumbered his forces and now seemed to have the weather itself as an ally, the Jomsviking commander ordered a retreat. His ships cut their grappling lines and turned for the open sea, leaving the rest of the fleet to continue fighting. The sagas are universally harsh in their judgment of this action. Sigvaldi fled, they say, abandoning his brothers to their fate. Whether this was cowardice, tactical pragmatism, or something else entirely, we cannot know. What we know is that a significant portion of the Jomsviking fleet escaped the battle while another portion did not. Bui Digri saw his men falling around him, the deck of his ship growing slick with blood. His brother had already died, cut down by Norwegian swords. The ship itself was sinking, taking on water through hull breaches that the desperate crew could not repair while fighting for their lives. Bui made his choice. He seized 2 chests of gold, the wealth he had accumulated through years of raiding and mercenary service, and leaped overboard, carrying the treasure with him into the cold waters of the fjord. Some accounts say he shouted a last defiant cry as he fell. Others say he went silently, preserving his dignity to the end. Either way, his body was never recovered. The sea took him and his gold together, the warrior and his wages united in death. The remaining Jomsvikings fought on until fighting became impossible. When their ships were taken, when their weapons were broken or torn from their hands, when there was simply no one left standing to continue the battle, the survivors surrendered. They had upheld their code as long as they could. They had given no ground willingly. They had shown no fear in the face of death. But they were mortal men, and mortal men can be overcome by sufficient numbers. The Battle of Hjörungavágr ended with Norwegian victory and Jomsviking defeat. But the story was not over. What happened next would become the most famous episode in the Brotherhood's history, the scene that posterity would remember long after the tactical details of the battle faded from memory. Earl Hakon ordered the prisoners executed. This was not unusual for the period. Ransoming enemies was common, but so was killing them, especially when the prisoners were as dangerous as the Jomsvikings. What was unusual was how the Jomsvikings met their deaths. The sources describe a mass execution conducted on shore, the prisoners seated in a row with their legs bound by a single rope. A Norwegian warrior named Thorkel Lera was appointed executioner. He worked his way down the line, sword in hand, taking heads one by one. And as he worked, the Jomsvikings demonstrated the quality that would immortalize them. The first man to die asked only that he be struck in the face rather than the neck, so that he could watch the blow coming. He wanted to see his death arrive. Thorkel obliged, and the man met the sword without flinching. The second prisoner made a joke about whether his hair would fall forward or back when his head was severed. He wagered that it would fall back, and he won the bet. His body collapsed backward as his head came free. Death, for these men, was not a tragedy to be mourned, but a final opportunity to demonstrate courage. Down the line, the executioner worked, and not one Jomsviking begged for mercy or wept with fear or tried to escape his fate. They made wry comments about the weather. They speculated about what Valhalla would be like. They criticized Thorkel's technique and offered suggestions for improvement. They laughed. The laughter is what the sagas emphasize, what later generations would remember and celebrate. These men, facing certain death after losing the most important battle of their lives, laughed at their executioners. The sound must have been extraordinary, dark and defiant and utterly fearless, echoing across the shore where Norwegian warriors stood witness. It was not the laughter of madness or hysteria. It was the laughter of men who had genuinely overcome the fear of death, who had internalized their code so completely that dying held no terror for them. One young prisoner, his hair particularly long and beautiful, asked that someone hold it out of the way so that it would not be bloodied by the stroke. A Norwegian warrior stepped forward to help, gripping the golden hair in his fists. But as Thorkel swung, the young Jomsviking jerked his head forward, causing the blade to sever the Norwegian's hands instead of his own neck. Even facing execution, even bound and helpless, the Jomsvikings found ways to strike back at their enemies. It was this incident, according to the sagas, that ended the executions. A Norwegian nobleman named Eiríkur, impressed by the courage and wit he had witnessed, intervened to spare the remaining prisoners. Among those saved was von Åkesson, who would go on to marry into Norwegian nobility and live a long life, a remarkable outcome for a man who had been moments away from death. The executions had served their purpose. The Jomsvikings had proven their point. Continuing would have been mere cruelty rather than justice. The survivors scattered. Some returned to Jomsborg if Jomsborg still existed. Some settled in Norway or Denmark or elsewhere in the north. Some, like Vagn, made new lives among former enemies. The Brotherhood as a coherent military force effectively ended at Hjörungavágr, though the fortress may have survived for some decades longer. The Great Age of the Jomsvikings, the period when they had influenced the political fate of kingdoms, was over. Yet their story was just beginning. Within a generation, the tales of Hjörungavágr and its aftermath were being told throughout the Norse world. The Jomsvikings saga was composed preserving the Brotherhood's history in literary form. Skalds composed verses celebrating the warriors who had died, laughing at their executioners. The Jomsvikings became legendary, their actual history mixing with embellishment and invention until the two became impossible to separate. This transformation from history to legend was not accidental. The Jomsvikings offered something that the Norse culture valued intensely, a model of how to die well. In a world where violent death was common, where disease and accident and warfare claimed lives constantly, how one faced the end mattered enormously. The Jomsvikings at Hjörungavágr provided the supreme example. They showed that death could be stripped of its terror, that courage could triumph even when the body was destroyed, that the manner of dying could confer immortality of a kind. The fortress of Jomsborg itself faded into obscurity. We do not know when it was finally abandoned or destroyed, if it ever existed in the form the sagas describe. Archaeological searches have failed to locate it definitively, though candidates have been proposed. Perhaps it lies buried beneath a modern city, its timbers rotted to nothing, its walls crumbled to rubble indistinguishable from ordinary soil. Perhaps it was always more conceptual than physical, a symbolic headquarters for a brotherhood that existed primarily in the relationships between its members rather than in any particular location. The uncertainty seems appropriate for an institution that balanced so carefully between history and myth. What survived was the idea. The Jomsvikings became a reference point for later generations, a standard against which other warriors could measure themselves. When medieval writers described elite military forces, they sometimes invoked the Jomsvikings as a comparison. When poets sought examples of supreme courage, they turned to Hjörungavágr. The Brotherhood's actual achievements, their victories in battle, their political influence, their role in the power struggles of the late 10th century, mattered less than their symbolic significance. This symbolic power derived primarily from that final scene, the execution on the shore. Everything the Jomsvikings had done before led to that moment and was retrospectively illuminated by it. Their rigorous training made sense because it produced men capable of laughing at death. Their code of conduct mattered because it gave them the psychological resources to face the executioner without fear. Their isolation from ordinary society, their renunciation of family ties, their embrace of warfare as a way of life, all of this found its justification in how they died. The Jomsvikings became, in the Norse imagination, something like warrior monks, men who had achieved through discipline, a transcendence that ordinary people could only admire from a distance. The comparison to religious communities is not coincidental. In the centuries after Hjörungavágr, as Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia, the monastic ideal became increasingly familiar to Norse audiences. Monks also lived in structured communities, bound by rules and vows, separated from ordinary society. They also subordinated individual desires to collective purpose. They also cultivated specific virtues through constant practice. The Jomsvikings could be understood retrospectively as a pagan equivalent, monks of war rather than prayer, devoted to martial excellence rather than spiritual perfection, but pursuing similar disciplines toward different ends. This interpretation may explain some of the Brotherhood's enduring appeal. As Norse society transformed under Christian influence, the memory of the Jomsvikings offered a connection to the old ways that was not entirely incompatible with new values. They represented pre-Christian virtue in a form that post-Christian audiences could respect. Their courage, their discipline, their loyalty to their brothers, these qualities remained admirable regardless of which gods one worshipped. The Jomsvikings could be honored without endorsing paganism, remembered without rejecting Christianity. The material traces they left behind are minimal. No Jomsviking sword has been definitively identified. No Jomsviking grave has been certainly located. No Jomsviking fortress has been excavated beyond doubt. They exist almost entirely in texts, sagas, histories, poetry, and in the cultural memory that these texts preserved and shaped. This is both a limitation and a freedom. We cannot verify the claims made about them through physical evidence, but neither are we constrained by that evidence. The Jomsvikings can mean whatever we need them to mean. For the medieval Norse, they meant that death could be conquered through courage. For later military historians, they meant that professional soldiers with shared standards could outperform larger forces of less disciplined warriors. For modern audiences, they might mean that brotherhood and shared purpose can create something greater than any individual could achieve alone. Each interpretation draws on the same basic material, but emphasizes different aspects, finds different lessons in the ancient stories. The sea that swallowed Buidigri and his gold still washes the Norwegian coast. The fjord, where the battle was fought, still reflects the sky, its waters indifferent to the blood that once reddened them. The shore where the executions took place has seen 1,000 winters since that day, each one burying deeper whatever physical traces the Jomsvikings left behind. Nature, as always, reclaims what human violence disrupts. But the stories remain. They survived the manuscript copying that preserved medieval literature through centuries of war and fire and neglect. They survived translation from Old Norse into modern languages, adapting to new vocabularies while retaining their essential power. They survived the transition from manuscript to print to digital text, finding new audiences in each medium. The Jomsvikings, who lived by the sword and died by the sword, achieved their immortality through words. Perhaps they would have appreciated the irony. These were men of action, warriors who expressed themselves through combat rather than conversation. Yet their legacy depends entirely on people who chose to write about them rather than fight beside them. Snorri Sturluson, the great Icelandic historian who preserved so much of Norse tradition, never held a Jomsviking shield or heard a Jomsviking war cry. He wrote about them from the distance of 2 centuries and the perspective of a very different world, but his words and the words of others like him gave the Jomsvikings a life that their swords and axes could never have achieved. The final Jomsviking to face execution at Hjörungavágr, before Eiríkur intervened to stop the killing, was moments away from becoming another name in a long list of the fallen. Instead, he lived, and through his survival, some portion of the Brotherhood's tradition continued. Vagn Åkesson carried the Jomsviking legacy into a new generation, though in transformed form. He married his former enemy's daughter. He settled in Norway. He lived a long life, dying peacefully rather than violently. Yet he remained, in some sense, a Jomsviking to the end, one of the Brotherhood, a survivor of Hjörungavágr, a man who had laughed in the face of death and walked away. What would the Jomsvikings make of their legend? if they could somehow know how they would be remembered. The question is unanswerable, of course, but worth considering. They sought glory, and they achieved it, though not in the form they probably expected. They sought wealth, and that wealth sank with buoy degree into the cold waters of the fjord. They sought victory, and they found defeat, yet their defeat became their greatest triumph, their death their path to immortality. The wind that howls through the Baltic on winter nights carries no memory of the oaths sworn at Jomsborg. The waves that crash against the Pomeranian coast know nothing of the warriors who once sailed from its harbors. The earth keeps its secrets, refusing to yield the fortress that may or may not lie somewhere beneath its surface. But in the tales that are still told, in the verses that are still read, in the imaginations of people separated from the Jomsvikings by 1,000 years and a dozen languages, the Brotherhood endures. They endure as an ideal, perhaps an impossible one, of what warriors can be when they subordinate everything to their calling. They endure as a warning about the costs of such subordination, the broken families, the early deaths, the violence that consumed them even as they sought to master it. They endure as a mystery, their true history tangled beyond recovery with the legends that grew up around them. They endure as a story, one of the great stories of the North, told and retold through the long dark winters when the fire burned low and the listeners drew closer to hear what came next. And at the heart of that story, always, is the laughter. The defiant, fearless, terrible laughter of men who had made peace with death and found in the end that death held no power over them. They laughed at their executioners. They laughed at their fate. They laughed at a world that thought it could destroy them simply by destroying their bodies. 1,000 years later, we can still hear that laughter echoing through the sagas, challenging us to match their courage, knowing that we probably cannot. The Jomsvikings are gone. Their fortress is dust. Their swords are rust. Their bones have returned to the earth from which all life springs, into which all life returns. But in the space between history and legend, in that uncertain territory where facts shade into myth and myth takes on the weight of truth, they remain what they always were. Warriors without fear, brothers unto death, the laughing dead of Hjörungavágr. And in that sense, the only sense that finally matters, they will never die.